My name's Kendall. I work in the school in the OSH actually, and I attend the night service here. But I'll be taking the service for us today. So the gospel reading that we had today is a really interesting gospel reading that's talking about peace in God and these ravens and these lilies and all these animals, and telling us to go out and sell our possessions. And it's really absurd. It seems really wacky when you really think about it. I know how I live my life, and there's things in my house I'm not going to go sell and give to the poor. You know, we all have possessions that we want, and we work hard for these things. But when we kind of dig down a little bit deeper, we can find what Luke is really trying to say to us, and what Jesus was saying. And they're talking about a lot of complex things, but they start by talking about how we're made for more. We're made for more than life on earth. And as Christians, we know this. We know that we have a God, and he is sovereign over everything, and we're made for more than he gives us. But verse 23 in this reading from Luke says that our life is made for more than food, and our bodies are made for more than clothes. Now, who likes food? Me. I really like food. Who likes wearing clothes? Me. Definitely wouldn't want to not wear clothes. And so Luke's talking about these really interesting things that are really integral to our lives as humans. In different cultures, what we eat defines kind of who we are. In different cultures, what we wear is defining to who we are. What we wear can really create a sense of identity. And so he's talking about these things that are integral to our identity, what we identify ourselves by. And he's saying life is more than this. And it's more than what we think we need to survive. We need food to survive. We need clothes to survive. And he's really saying life is more than this, which is really great to hear. But where does that come from? So I'm going to read to you a reading from Genesis, which we did not have read just before. It is, if I can find it, Genesis chapter 1, right at the beginning. Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, which says, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. So here he's talking about, he's made Adam and Eve and all the creatures, and now he's saying to Adam, fill the earth and subdue it. This is the first thing I'm asking you to do. And then he goes on, God in chapter 2, when he puts Adam into the garden, he says, the Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. So when we look back at this, and Luke says our life is more than what we're made for, and we take it back to Genesis, and God created humans and he put them in the garden for two things. The first thing he said was work the garden. So he's asking us to do this thing that's work. But then he says, fill the earth and subdue it. Fill his kingdom. Multiply what God has put here, and so that it can be for his glory. It's an interesting thing, but God initially created us to unify with him. And when he created Adam, he created him to do these two things, to work in the garden and to fill the kingdom. And then Adam and Eve, when the fall happened, they're taken away from Jesus. They're not in that intimate space with Jesus, and there's chaos. Everything unravels, everything unfolds itself. And so we can find that when we're only living for the things that are on the earth, our life is chaotic. And so we're expected to live differently. And this is displayed throughout the whole Bible. You look through Exodus and all the Old Testament, it's law after law after law. Then we have new covenants and the 10 Commandments. And then in this verse, it says we're more than the pagan world. And so as Christians, we're expected to live differently, which is great. But how do we do that? There's an interesting thing Jesus goes on to outline throughout the whole Gospels. You're different to these people. You need to live differently, but it's hard to know how to do it in a modern world. We don't live in Bible times, and so it's difficult to know how we're meant to do that. But Jesus then, secondly, goes on to point out that he will provide. So we're called to live differently, and when we live differently, he provides for us. He says to us, do not worry about your life and what you eat. And he says, do not worry about your body and what you wear. And we know that life is more than what we eat and what we wear. But then he says, don't worry about it. It's human to worry. I worry. I'm sure all of you worry. It's human to worry. We live in a world of unsureness and turmoil and constant, what's going to happen? I don't know what's this. And it's hard to trust in the being that we can't see. That's completely human. But when we shift our focus from God to our worry, everything around us just collapses. But God gives us this really good example in creation. When he makes Adam and Eve, he gives us this example of what we're meant to do. When he put them in the garden, he gave them a creation that was entirely reverent to God. And then Luke goes on to outline the ravens and the lilies. And he talks about the ravens, how they don't go out and they don't find food and they don't go out and stress about what they're going to eat and then hide it away for the winter, but they just sit and they just do what they're meant to do. They live in trees, they fly around, and God provides food for them. And then it talks about the lilies, how they don't stress about what's going on, they just grow. They just grow in the circumstances that God has put them in. And so when we live in the context, when the ravens live in the context that they're put in, and the lilies live in the context that they're put in, they do what they're made for. They do what God called them for. And they thrive in that context. They thrive entirely relational and reliant on God. And we're given this example. They don't need anything. God gives it to them. I don't think that the flowers pop their buds open in the morning and they go, where am I going to get my sun from today? It's there. They know that it's there and they trust that God's going to provide that for him. And this is how God intended them to live. He intended the flowers to pop open every morning and be excited for the day and just spend their time growing. And he designed the ravens to live in trees and build nests and fly around and know where their food source comes from. And so they grow in how God intended and entirely dependent on God. Now again, we're human. We know in the fall, it's explained over and over again, we can't live up to the expectations that we were created for. But we can look around in our creation and the environments we're in and the roses I can see outside and the trees, and I saw a little bird hop past before, and we can see these things and we can learn from these things. Now, we're much more valuable than birds. We're much more valuable than flowers, and Jesus goes on to talk about this. He says, how much more valuable are you than birds, and how much more will God clothe you than the flowers? And so God promises us that we will have more in our life when we can trust in him, and our life in him when we set our expectations in God. Everything else around us will fall into place. And so we can look around us and we can see abundant opportunity and that God is providing. And so when we set our lives in God, our provision and our peace comes from him. And we can treasure what we have in heaven and our relationship with God, and we don't need to worry about the things of the earth. Now, that's all well and good. We know that we're made for something different, and we know that we're going to be provided for by God and we can live in his provisions. But God then calls us into more. He calls the ravens into more than sitting around waiting for food, and he calls the lilies into more than waking up and growing. And we're called for more as well. Now, he tells us to sell our possessions, which it's a big thing. I don't really want to go out and sell all my things and live out a backpack and live out of my car, because maybe that's practical for some people, but I know that wouldn't work for my life, But we're called to, instead of directly selling our possessions and taking everything that we have and giving it out, although, like I said, that might be practical for some people, what he's really saying is that we're called to use the things that he provides with us as blessings for others. And maybe that may be looking at the abundances that we have and using them to provide directly for others. And maybe it might look like taking the love that he gives to us and he shares to us and showing that to the rest of the world. But when we trust in God and he provides, he calls us to use what he provides for the good of others and to benefit others. And this can be in our everyday actions, and we can create and transform our everyday actions into an offering and an act of service and worship to God. So go back to Genesis. We had the verse in Genesis that when God put man in the garden and he says, okay, you've got to work it. Now, in the Hebrew text, the word for work that they used in Genesis was abad. And if you look the rest of the way through Genesis, and I can't read Hebrew, I trust that this is the right thing, but if you go through Genesis, the word abad is used in 3 different contexts. It's used for work, and it's used in the context of service, and it's also used to mean worship. And so what if we think about the fact that work and service and worship are all one idea? They're all one thing. And when God provides in our life, when he gives us abundant seas, we can put them out into the world. Whether it's in the context of work, it might be your job that you're doing. Whether it's an act of service, providing for your community, working towards a goal with a group of people. Or maybe it's an act of worship. It's you coming wholly before God. Whatever it is, God provides these abundant seas in our lives when we fully rely on him. And we can use all of our life, everything he provides, as an act of work and service and worship towards him. So no matter what the world takes, our life is still abundant. Jesus reassures us that when our life is centered around God, everything else will be taken care of. We're made for God. We were made to live in God. Adam was created to live and thrive off God and what God had provided. And we can know that when life is too much, that we're greater than life. We're not called to just live in this world here, but we're called to put all of our hope and peace and trust in God, and he provides that same peace and trust to us, and then we can use it to provide to the world. So I'd like you to think about that as you go into your week. My 3 main takeaways for anyone that might have zoned out. This is your time to come back in. We're made for more than our life on earth. God provides when we put our trust in him. And then we can live in our calling, which is to worship him with what he provides. So now we're going to have another song, I believe, which will have our offering come around.